All right, so today we're talking about feudal Japan. The word feudal is a word that you have seen before, believe it or not. Talked about that word in our sections on medieval Europe or the Middle Ages. And so this is a word that came up when we were talking about the relationship between knights and lords and serfs and peasants in Europe. And basically, it has the same meaning in Japan. It turns out that feudalism uh, is something that occurred in many places across the world, and it's not just something that happened in the Middle Ages. And basically, feudalism, and this is the subpoint down here, feudalism is built on the relationships that hold society together. Um, so if you think about the relationships that hold society together today, it's less about, there are relationships, but we are held together by laws. There are rules that we live by. But then there's also relationships that hold society together, relationships between a parent and a child, relationships between government and citizens. If you think about government and citizens, the relationship that holds them together is that the government, most of the politicians are elected by citizens, but then those elected officials will institute laws that affect citizens. So there's a relationship there. Um, it's built on this idea that each person has a share of the power. And so those relationships back in feudalism were more based on land and protection, is what we're going to talk about. So that brings us to the question of what is feudalism. This is a good definition. There's a typo in it, but that's still a good definition. It's a system in which people worked and fought for nobles who gave them protection and land in return. So if you think about this, there is one person. Let's imagine a village where there's one person that owns all of the land. But if you own all of the land and there's a bunch of people around you who want the land, they're going to kill you and take your land, right? If there's one kid in the class that's holding all of the Legos and he's saying no one else can have any of the Legos, and then there's 20 other kids in the class, likely that kid that has all the Legos is going to lose them because he is trying to hoard them for himself. And so if that kid was smart who had all the Legos, what he would do instead would be he would say to another kid, hey, I will give you a share of my Legos if you help protect me from the other kids. And so he would pick a handful of kids to protect him so he could keep a large portion of the Legos with just giving a few of them away as opposed to the whole class ganging up on him and taking all of his Legos away. And so that's the basic idea behind feudalism. It's the idea that in order to maintain your wealth and power, you have to use some of it to buy people to protect you. So let's talk about the most important person in the feudal pyramid. It's the shogun. The shogun is at the top. The shogun, if you can think about him in Middle Ages terms like a king, he sits at the top. He has the ultimate power. He's the highest rank in the military. So he's in some sense like a king, but also in some sense like a general. He sits in the position of power and wealth. And he even had more power than the emperor. The emperor was kind of like in England today. There are still kings and queens, but the person that runs the government is the prime minister. The prime minister is, quote, is kind of like appointed by the king, but he's really elected by the people of England. And the prime minister has the real power. The king just kind of sits there like in big fancy palaces and, goes for pictures and stuff and, doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of, actual running the government. But it's more kind of like, it's just like a ceremonial thing, like something that's was important in the past and they still hold on to it because it's a nice idea. And so the shogun is the same way. The shogun actually runs the government, whereas the emperor is kind of more this ceremonial, important person that doesn't have a lot of day-to-day involvement with running the government. And so the main thing that the shogun would do, and this was his main main ability to have some power was to give land. His main power was not to raise armies and attack people. His main power was not to, control all the details of government. Really, what he did was he determined who should have land, and he gave the land to these daimos, or daiyos, excuse me. I've looked this up and done a little research. Some of these Japanese words are hard to pronounce, but I believe that the M is silent, so it's like daio. Um, and so the shogun would give land to these daio. These daio are like rich nobles. And in return, the daio would protect him. So he would give them land, and the daio would feel that they've been given a great gift by the shogun, and the only thing that they should do in response is to protect the shogun. So now let's talk about these daio. So the shogun gave daio, again, land in return for protection. And then the daiyos, in turn, would rule that land. So, if you think about it back in the Middle Age terms, you have the king, then you've got the lords, and the lords control the land. And they would rule these little sections of land that they were given by the shogun. They would basically be the little mini kings of their own land. And they would tax the people who live there. So you had peasants and farmers who would live on the land, just like in Europe in the Middle Ages. And they would grow stuff, and the daio would say, well, at the end of the year, you're going to give me a certain percentage of whatever you grow on your land. And this was how the daio were able to live these extremely wealthy lifestyles, because they didn't have to pay taxes themselves, because they just got their land in return for protecting the shogun. There was no money involved. And they could tax the people that lived on their land whatever rate that they wanted. And as a result, they became very, very wealthy. And so many say the daio, even more than the shogun, had the ultimate power, because they had access to money, they controlled land, and they also controlled the protection. So the daio and the samurai. The daio and the samurai had a special relationship. The daio were the ones who basically hired the samurai. The samurai, it's a fancy word, and when you hear the word samurai, you probably think of this like fancy super soldier, and you think samurai swords. But samurais were basically just knights. They're very similar to knights, Knights. Like in Europe, knights that were important, but essentially soldiers hired to protect the daio and the shogun. And so the daio would hire these soldiers to live on the land and protect. And they had a way of making the soldiers work to be the best. So the daio would typically give some samurai actually land in exchange for protection. And the land was typically given to the most powerful or the most highly regarded of the samurai. And as a result, it increased competition to become the most powerful, so you could get land from the daio. So let's imagine that an emergency happened and there was an invasion in the daio's land. The samurai would go to war to protect their daio. Their daio was their master. And so this was the relationship between the samurai and the daio. So you can remember we talked about relationships. Each person has a little bit of power. So the daio give some of the samurai land, and in exchange for that land, they basically commit their lives. Which leads us to talk about the samurai. So the samurai's whole existence on the daio's estate was to protect them. And they lived by this code. This code is called Bushido. We've talked about it before. It's essentially a warrior's code or the samurai code. And this code was created in some sense by the daio in order to convince the samurai that, or force the samurai to be willing to give their lives for the daio. So if it came down to it, and it was the daio or yourself, the samurai would always sacrifice oneself. Or if the daio was going to lose some land, the samurai would fight to the death in order to protect the daio's interests. So when a samurai commits to a daio, he's basically saying, I will die before you. And so most samurai had a daio or a master that they lived and worked for. But on occasion, there were samurai who did not have a daio, and these samurai were called ronin. Ronin is simply a Japanese word that means wandering man. So ronin just means someone who doesn't have a home and is wandering around. Samurais became ronin when their masters died. Now, if you remember what we just talked about, the code before this, the Bushido, said that samurai should give their lives to their masters, and they should die before their masters die. So you can imagine that the only situation in which a samurai would be wandering around is if their master has died, and that's typically how a samurai became a ronin. But if their masters died before them, essentially what's happened is that they've broken their special code, the Bushido, that they follow. So what they've done is they have not followed through on their commitments as a samurai. And so as a result, people in medieval Japan would see ronin as people who have failed to follow the code, people who have not protected their masters well enough. And so they were looked down upon. They were looked down upon as lesser than soldiers. And so as a result, many of these soldiers who became ronin would often kill themselves because they did not follow through on their code. And that's how severe they took, or how serious they took the code that they followed. The final group of people that lived on the estates were the peasants. Now, the peasants, just like the samurai, they lived on the daio's land, and they would receive land. They didn't actually own the land, but they would receive land to farm food, and they would pay taxes to the daio. Ultimately, the samurai would also protect the peasants because the peasants were the source of the daio's tax money or income. And so you can see that all of these different groups, the shogun, the daio, the samurai, and the peasants, they're all connected through this land. The land is the connection point between all of them, and each one gives the other something in exchange for the land. And so that's what held all the people together, is the shared use of the land. So feudalism lasted in the culture of Japan in many ways. So if you think about it, feudal relationships are about a lower subject, so like a peasant or a samurai, giving a more powerful person loyalty. There's this movie I saw as a kid that left an impact on me. It was called, I think it was called The Bodyguard or something. It was essentially a movie about a very small kid who gets protected by this older kid at school because he's getting bullied all the time. And in exchange, the smaller kid, who's very smart, helps the older kid with his classwork. And this kind of relationship of give and take, it describes kind of the feudal relationship. You give your ultimate loyalty to a master, and then that master gives you some kind of gift. And so Japanese society today is very hierarchical, meaning that if you work for somebody like a boss, you show him extreme loyalty. And that loyalty is required in order to work for that boss. And this loyalty can extend to family, to work, to everywhere in society. In the U.S., we have a very different idea, and you can see this picture right over here. In the U.S., loyalty is less important of a value as individualism. So the idea is that instead of showing your ultimate loyalty to a boss, you should go and find a job that you like. Or instead of showing ultimate loyalty to your parents who want you to, let's say, go to a certain college or have a certain job. You would prioritize instead what you want as an individual. And so this idea of extreme loyalty is very different than the ideas that we have in the United States about how we should live our lives. And that's not true for everybody. There's certain people in the United States where loyalty, family loyalty or loyalty to work is more important. But generally, the culture of the United States is much more individualistic. We care much more about what we want than honoring what our boss or parent or someone else wants. And so that's one way of seeing a difference between our two cultures. So hopefully this was kind of a review. We've covered a lot of these concepts before, but hopefully it makes sense. Next week we are moving on to a new unit. So this is our final week talking about Japan. And so this is kind of a final culmination in understanding what Japanese society was like.